Hi there, and welcome to our next lecture. We're going to be continuing talking about plants today, and specifically, we're going to be talking about seed plants, and then more specifically, we'll be talking about what are called naked seed plants. So, this is going to be chapter 30. My goal here for this lecture is to talk about derived traits for seed plants and then to look at the respective phyla for the naked seed plants, Cycadophyta, Ginkgophyta, and then we have Coniferophyta. So if we go back and we look at this concept map that I've shown the last couple of lectures, right? We're working our way down, so we're obviously in the kingdom Plantae still. We already covered the non-vascular plants, those are your mosses and your liverworts. We moved over last time to the vascular plants, but we were looking at seedless vascular plants. Ferns, the horsetail, you looked at Psilotum, and you looked at the Lycophyta, so on and so forth. So where we're going to go then today is we're going to talk about plants that have vascular tissue and now seeds with a few other derived traits in addition to seeds. And as you can imagine, there are thousands upon thousands of species of seed plants. And so those are broken up into two different groups, angiosperms and gymnosperms. The gymnosperms are referred to commonly as the naked seed plants because they make seeds exposed to the environment, usually on cones, like think a pine cone, without a flower. After the gymnosperms evolve, we're going to get this next group called angiosperms, and this is going to be where you're going to see then seeds with flowers. We're going to save this group here for the next lecture. So today we're going to just go with what seed plants have, how they're different than the seedless vascular plants, and then we're going to talk about specific gymnosperms. Okay, so your seed plants, they are quite successful, as you can imagine. They've been around for about 360 million years, and they pretty much dominate all of the landscape that's out there because, as you can imagine, the seed works really well. And so the last two groups of plants that we've looked at, I was describing them as being spore reproducing plants. That's no longer the case here. Now we're going to talk about these as seed reproducing plants. Although the spore is still part of the life cycle, they no longer are reliant upon that as a reproductive cell. Now that's going to be taken over by seeds. Okay, so what you guys see here, this is from page 650 from your textbook. We have 5 derived traits of seed plants: reduced gametophyte, heterospory, ovules, pollen, and then here's the big one, seeds. So I'm just going to go through these 5 here and give you a little bit of detail about them before we move on and talk about specific phyla of plants that have seeds. Okay, let's look first at the reduced gametophyte. So guys, the reduced gametophyte, this was something that I mentioned during our last lecture. If you can recall, the gametophyte stage, right, that's the haploid stage of the life cycle that is responsible for making the gametes. That was the dominant stage of the life cycle in the bryophytes. Does not stay as the dominant stage of the life cycle when we get to the seedless vascular plants. Now the sporophyte stage is the dominant stage of the life cycle. So if I asked you, well, what happened to the gametophyte stage from the bryophytes to the seedless vascular plants? It's not that it totally went away, but it becomes highly reduced in size. I mentioned that. I showed you pictures of that, okay? Where in the bryophytes, the gametophyte was the green leafy part of the plant that was completely independent, could feed itself. When you looked at things like the fern life cycle, the gametophyte was very small, reduced. It was the heart-shaped gametophyte. It lasts just long enough to make sperm and egg. It allows the sporophyte to start to grow, and then it dies. And it's within the soil, just about a couple of millimeters under the level of the soil. So going to be something pretty insignificant, okay, as far as size goes. Well, that reduction in size of the gametophyte continues. And so when we get to the seed plants, the gametophyte is so reduced that it's basically just going to be a matter of a few cells like you see here, or even just a single cell like you would see here, okay? So female gametophyte, male gametophyte. Now, we talked about Archegonia and Antheridia. Those are part of the gametophyte stages, right? For both previous groups of plants making sperm cells and egg cells. We don't normally refer to the Antheridia anymore here. We're just going to refer to a microsporangium, a microspore, and then a pollen grain, which is the male gametophyte. But I can still use the term archegonia. So I'm going to have a megasporangium, which would make a megaspore, okay, which is going to be the archegonia, which is then going to make the egg cells, i.e. the female gametophytes. So again, don't worry about Antheridia in this group here, but we do sometimes refer to the archegonia. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so your male gametophyte and your female gametophyte, they are surrounded by sporophyte tissues. You can see this tan tissue right here, that sporophyte tissue that is surrounding the gametophyte in its entirety, and then you've got a casing around here, okay, that is protecting the male gametophyte, which is going to be the sperm nucleus here inside this structure that is called a pollen grain. And what this does is it allows then these male and female gametophytes to be protected because they're surrounded by sporophyte tissue and also nourished, right? So that's obviously going to increase the chances of survival of sperm and egg because they are housed and nourished compared to the previous two groups of plants where the sperm and the egg were just released. Remember, we had to have water so that the sperm cells could swim and go fertilize the egg cells, but that's not exactly how it's going to happen anymore. Okay, so kind of a good segue then from the male and the female gametophytes then. These plants, for the seed plants, are all going to be heterosporous, or they're all going to exhibit heterospory. Last time it was the opposite. They were all homosporous, making the same type of spores. This time, though, they are making different types of spores, hence the term hetero. So a term that I used last time was microsporangium. Remember that the sporangium makes the spores, and micro is going to mean small. So I have a microsporangium that's going to give rise to a microspore this time that's going to give rise to the male gametophyte, which is going to be the sperm nucleus. On another part of the plant, I'm going to have a megasporangium that's going to make megaspores, that's going to make the female gametophyte, that will be the egg cells. Okay, so the rule here is for seed plants then that they are all going to be heterosporous, and that the gametophytes are very small and going to be protected by the sporophyte tissue. So you're no longer going to see archegonia and antheridia on gametophyte tissue. This is what it looks like right here. And I'll take you through the life cycles, hopefully, and point that out and make it clearer for you. Okay. In addition to having reduced gametophytes and to being heterosporous, we also then have this new structure here that are called ovules. And an ovule is synonymous with the term megasporangium. So the megasporangium, okay, which is what they're using right here, is diploid. So you know, because it's sporangium, that's on the sporophyte stage, it's diploid. It is going to make a haploid megaspore, so that hasn't changed. So this diploid tissue is going to go through meiosis in a certain part of itself and make a megaspore. That megaspore then is going to eventually become an egg cell that we'll talk about later. The megasporangium plus the megaspore plus this brown stuff on the outside here that's called the integument. Notice that is also diploid, just like the megasporangium, so it must come from the sporophyte stage. All three of these things together, the integument, the megaspore, and the megasporangium, then is going to make an ovule. And what you're seeing here in this diagram is going to be this, but just further developed. Okay, so we have ovules now. The ovules are going to be the megasporangium that are going to be responsible for eventually making the egg cells, and they are covered and protected by an integument. Okay, we have pollen. So up to this point, then, I've been mentioning that water is required for reproduction because the sperm cells are flagellated, right? And the sperm cells needed to be able to swim to the egg cells. Well, in most cases, this is not going to be true. Now we're going to have pollen grains, and the pollen grains are going to be carrying then the male gametophyte. That is the sperm nuclei. And so this no longer is going to require water to reach the egg cell, like for example up in here. And pollen is usually going to be carried by wind, water, or animals. Okay, so we no longer have flagellated sperm cells. This is going to allow then for the pollen to be able to travel much further distances than it ever could in any of the other plants. Okay, here's the big one, seeds. So again, we refer to these plants as seed reproducing plants. This is then the structure that they are going to use for reproduction. So when we go and we look at what makes up a seed, it's going to look like this, 3 parts: the seed coat, the food supply, and the embryo. If I were to ask you, where did this come from? If we go just 2 rows up, the integument, the megaspore, and the megasporangium. All of these things after fertilization will turn into the seed. So it is fair to say then that the ovule does develop into a seed. And if you look at the parts, they're all there. So the seed coat, okay, that's going to allow for massive amounts of protection around the embryo, is from the integument tissue right here. If we expand then on the megaspore and it gets bigger, okay, it's going to have 2 things in it. It's going to have an embryo. It's this kind of little fork-like looking structure. That's going to be then after the sperm cell fertilizes the egg cell. And then, of course, because the embryo is embedded in the seed and cannot feed for itself yet, it has to have a food supply. And so that food supply then is this tan tissue here that's going to come from this tan tissue here that was originally part of the megaspore. So once more, this seed here that we see with the seed coat, the food supply, and the embryo has developed then from an ovule that was fertilized by a sperm cell. And this is what we have. So the seed coat, it's really important. It allows then for the embryo to survive sometimes long periods of time in a dormant stage. It could be days, it could be weeks, it could even be all the way up to years, to many years. It protects then the embryo and therefore also the food supply. If the seed finds itself in an environment that is too hot, if it's way too cold, it protects then the embryo from an environment that is maybe way too dry or too harsh. So if you think about it, sometimes animals, right, they'll go eat in the fruits, or they'll eat seeds, and those will make their way through the digestive tract, which is a very harsh environment, very acidic. And so having a thick seed coat then allows the seed to just pass through the digestive tract of the animal, come out in the fecal matter unharmed. And now it's out of the animal, away from the parent plant, and couldn't be any better because now it's even in its own little packet of manure, if you will. So the seed coat can be quite thick, and it's definitely going to be there for protection. The seeds can travel long distances, kind of like the pollen. The seeds can be moved by wind sometimes. They can be moved by water, and they can also be moved by animals. Okay, so these are your 5 derived traits, guys. You won't have a quiz on this, but you will see this on the next exam. So I really need to make sure that you're understanding this. So go through this with your notes, of course. Read through it in the textbook. And then if you have any questions, please, as always, don't hesitate to email me. And we'll work our way through the topic here. Okay, so I'm going to go back to this screen here. And I've highlighted that just this right here, the gymnosperms. And the gymnosperms then that we're going to be talking about are from this table over here, which again, you have seen 3 times, okay? So we're going to be looking at the seed plants. We're going to be looking at these guys here called the gymnosperms, commonly referred to as the naked seed plants. And we have 3 representative phyla that we're going to be interested. There are 4, but if you notice, I have put a line through this one. I don't have anything to show you there, so we'll just omit that one. So we're going to be talking then today about the phylum Ginkgophyta, the phylum Cycadophyta, and then the phylum Coniferophyta. And as you can see, we've got many different number of known species for the phylum Coniferophyta, commonly referred to as conifers. These I would imagine you're quite familiar with. We have far less cycads that I'll show you. You guys might know these as sago palms. And then we have only 1 known species remaining from the phylum Ginkgophyta. Okay, so Just so that you are understanding what we're talking about before I go through each of the representative phyla here, guys, I just wanted to show you kind of quickly diversity, if you will, in what some of the naked seed plants would look like. So typically they're going to have needle-shaped leaves, as you can see there, here, okay? Not always, but that is the norm. And they're going to be using cones or strobili. You should know that term. Can't see any over here, but over here, to make their seeds. So again, these are the naked seed plants. They have all of the derived characteristics, plus all of the other characteristics from the previous groups of plants, but they do not have flowers. No flowers exist at all in this group. Okay, they are well suited to dry conditions, and one of the reasons why that is the case is because of the shape of their leaves. So I can see this one quite well here. So these needle-shaped leaves that you can see there, and then these ones over here, their size then increases surface area. And that surface area is going to reduce then desiccation or the loss of water from happening. The other reason why these guys are suited to drier environments, and if you think about it, if we go here to the center, to the sequoia, right? Needle-shaped leaves, you see that they are in a higher elevation type area. Lots of snow on the ground, but that is not available water. So if you think about maybe when you go camping or you go hiking and you're up in the mountains and you see things like the sequoias and the redwoods if you're close to home, okay? In the summer, it's pretty dry and pretty hot up there. Maybe they get some water in the form of rain, but most of the time when their water falls, it's going to be frozen and it's going to be in the form of snow. So as you can imagine, if you were a tree and you were living in an area where it snows a lot, and you had a big broad leaf, so like if you just look at the palm, or you look at your hand rather, and you open up your fingers and you have the palm of your hand there, some other plants have leaves that look like this, and that would be a perfect little catch for snow. But if it snows profusely and you were catching and catching and catching snow, right, eventually that snow is going to be so heavy on that leaf that it's just going to break right off and fall. And that's not what the plant wants, because many of these plants are going to be evergreen, which means that they have their leaves 365 days a year. So having a needle-shaped leaf, yeah, some snow could land on the surface of the leaf, but definitely not going to catch enough to break the leaves off. So one of the big reasons why they are well suited to drier conditions. Okay. So let's go ahead and look then. I'm at C number 3. I'm going to go to gymnosperm diversity. And gymnosperm is, again, another common name for the group. So guys, sorry, there's lots of common names here. Naked seed plant, gymnosperms, conifers. But now we're going to go to the actual names of the phyla that you do need to know for the exam. Okay, here is the first group, called phylum Cycadophyta, again commonly referred to as the cycads. And if you drive around town, I would imagine that you probably see these in many yards. I actually have one right outside my window here that I can see as I'm sitting here and lecturing to you guys. And once in a while, these things are referred to as sago palms because they look like palm trees, kind of like short palm trees. But they're not a palm tree at all, because palm trees, believe it or not, make flowers. And again, because we are in the naked seed plants, there is no flower whatsoever involved in these life cycles. So here's one version. The cone or the strobilus that they use then to make their sperm and their eggs look like this over here. These guys are going to be dioecious, which means that there are two houses for the different types of strobili. So you can have a male cycad and you can have a female cycad. You're never going to find male and female reproductive structures on the same plant. This one right here happens to be a male. So these are 3 male cones or male strobili. These plants have been around for many, many, many years. They were dominant during the Mesozoic era. And this right here is a picture from your textbook, figure 30.6, I believe. And it's showing then a fossil of an insect from that time period with pollen grains attached to it. And this is about 110 million years old. And these cycads were actually one of the dominant types of plants during the age of the dinosaurs. So the dinosaurs liked to kind of eat these cycads. But we don't have many left. And what we do have left are endangered. Okay, one thing I do want to point out here is that these guys, even though they have pollen, they still have flagellated sperm cells. So their pollen grain is not just carrying a sperm nucleus like it will in almost all of the other seed plants, but rather it's carrying an actual flagellated sperm cell. And so when these male cones here release their pollen, right, and maybe it goes over here into the female cycad, that pollen grain will crack open, if you will, and that flagellated sperm cell has to have water in order to reach the egg that's in the female tree. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. This will also be pretty straightforward in your lab. There's not actually a lot to look at for this group. The next group that we're going to look at then is the phylum Gingophyta. Maybe you guys have heard of this before, Ginkgo biloba. Okay, that's the one living species that we have. These guys have leaves that are typically fan-shaped like this, so not at all not at all needle-like, but they are very indicative in this fan shape with this kind of little invagination here in the center. You can't make it out there, but that's what all of the leaves look like. Another difference here is that these will lose their leaves, so they are not evergreen, but they are deciduous. That is the term that you use, deciduous, when a plant loses its leaves in the fall. It is like the cycads. This group of plants, though, is also going to be dioecious, which means that it has two different homes. Okay, so they are going to be either male or female. And what you're looking at right here, this is a female tree. And I know that this is a female tree because what has been produced then are these fleshy seed coat seeds, not to be mixed up as a fruit. Fruits, guys, only come when you have flowers. And do you have flowers in this group? No, you do not. Okay. So if you were going to go out and you were going to buy a ginkgo, because ginkgos are really good for our area, especially in very urbanized areas, because they have a high tolerance to air pollution. So we have a ginkgo in between the SC wing of the biology department, so just right outside the door from our lab, and then going over to the chemistry wing, there's a big ginkgo that's there in between the two buildings or wings of the building. And every summer when the female tree, because we have a female tree, drops then her seeds, people inadvertently walk all over them because the sidewalk there, the little sidewalk, is littered with them. And the seed coats give off a very distinctive, very foul odor, and it smells like vomit. So if you were ever going to go buy a ginkgo to plant in your yard, you probably don't want to pick a female tree. You want to pick a male tree. The male tree makes just very small little cones that makes the pollen. The female then is going to have other cones that have the ovule waiting for the pollen. When fertilization happens, you're going to get then these little not fruits, but seeds with fleshy seed coats on them. Okay. We used to work on these in grad school, and when we worked on these, we would have to actually go under the fume hood because they smelled so putrid. And then one last thing that I'll say about this group is that they too, like the cycads, they still have flagellated sperm. So they do have the pollen grain, but the pollen grain, like I said previously, is carrying a sperm cell that is flagellated. Okay, last group here, and this is the one that you're going to be most familiar with, I would imagine, is the phylum Coniferophyta, commonly referred to as conifers. These are going to be the largest group of the gymnosperms of the naked seed plants. And you can see that there's a whole variety of different types of conifers from the textbook, figure 30.7. So This tree right here, probably my favorite plant on earth. These are going to be your sequoias, okay, and your redwoods. They are so massive. You can make out, right, this adult person right there. Can't really see if it's a male or a female, but there is an adult person standing there at the base of the tree. If you were to look at the amount of biomass that the sequoia tree has, it would be equivalent to 24 blue whales or 40,000 adult humans. So massive tree. Right outside your backyard too. If you've never been out to see the sequoias and the redwoods, I would highly recommend it. It's a bucket list item. There is a short drive out of Porterville to a trail called the Trail of 100 Giants. It's about a mile loop, I believe, and it's a paved loop. Hardest part about getting there is the parking. But if you can get out of your car and go do just a nice stroll on a paved trail, you'll see many, many, many sequoias there. Okay, Doug firs, and this one is highlighted because the Doug fir, this is going to be our main source of lumber here in the United States. This one right here, your European larch. So these ones, this is the Matterhorn in Europe. This is not Disneyland, but the real Matterhorn mountain, okay? And you can see everything looks like it's kind of going through fall color change. But what's happening here is that these guys, they can actually withstand temperatures that are about, I believe, 54 degrees Fahrenheit below freezing. And so it takes special types of proteins to be able to survive in an area like that. So they're unique in that way. Okay, this guy here, the bristlecone pine, this is also in your backyard. So if you head up to Bishop, right, on your way to Mammoth, there is what is called the bristlecone pine forest. And it's kind of a drive off of the highway there and then a windy road into the forest. But what's unique about this, I know that if you look at this tree, you're like, well, it doesn't even look like it's alive, but it is. There's some greenery happening over here. And here there is a tree that they have discovered and named Methuselah. And they have found that Methuselah is about 4,500 years old. Within the last couple of years, they found another tree even older than Methuselah, and they named it Methuselah 2. So didn't have a lot of creativity going on there, but you've got Methuselah 1 and Methuselah 2 out in the bristlecone pine forest on your way up to Mammoth. You know, if you go there and you're going to go try to find the actual two oldest trees within that forest, obviously they don't have them marked because, as you can imagine, as soon as they let us know which one were those two trees, obviously somebody would go in there and damage them. So two things to highlight here just on this screen alone, guys. This right here, your sequoia, this is the largest organism. Listen to what I'm saying. Organism, not plant, but organism on the planet. And we have that here in our good old state of California. And you have the oldest living organism, or so they think, here in the state of California. So pretty cool facts. And then the last one that they're showing you here in figure 30.7 is the common juniper. Again, you can see those needle-shaped leaves there. But what I want to point out here are these little blue, fleshy, not fruits, but seeds with fleshy seed coats. So just like you saw in the ginkgo, right? Please don't confuse these as seeds because, again, you have to have a flower to have a seed and we're not, you have to have a flower to have a fruit and we're not there yet. So these are simply going to be seeds with a fleshy seed coat, not to be mixed up with a fruit. Okay, I'm going to finish up then by highlighting figure 30.4. And this is going to be a typical pine life cycle. So this is the life cycle for the group that I'm showing you. So this is going to be the one that you're going to want to remember. I'm not going to worry about you knowing the cycad life cycle or the ginkgo life cycle. This is the one that is pretty representative actually of the whole group. So again, this is just simply going to be alternation of generations, right? If we start over here with our mature sporophyte, so that's diploid, okay? This is going to be monoecious, meaning one house with two different types of cones, the ovulate cone. So hopefully you understand that that means that that's the female cone, right? Because it's going to be making the ovules. And remember that inside the ovules are the egg cells. And maybe just lower on that same branch, for example, you're going to have then pollen cones. And these are going to be the male cones. You can see that they're much, much smaller. And their job is to make pollen. So if you take and you look at the female cone, the ovulate cone, and you cut it open and you get a slice out of it so that you can see what's going on the inside, here's what you're going to have. So you're going to have one of these little kind of diamond-shaped structures that's called a bract, and what it looks like on the inside is this. And so you can see that you have these yellow circles here, and these are going to be ovules, hence ovulate cone. So the ovule, remember, is inside the sporophyte tissue. It's going to have archegonia that are going to make egg cells, okay? Now, that's developing there, and when she is ready, when the ovulate cone is ready to accept pollen, then each one of these little diamond-shaped structures housing the ovules, they will open up, and they will expose then the ovules to the air. And about that same time, hopefully, then the pollen cone has pollen that is ready to be released. So if I slice open a pollen cone, just one of them, I'm going to have something that looks very much like the Equisetum strobilus, where I'm going to have many sporangia. There's one, there's one, there's one, and there's one, making microspores inside. Those microspores then are going to develop into pollen grains, okay? So I have haploid ovules, I have haploid pollen coming from diploid sporophyte. So if I were to ask you what process allowed for this to occur, you should be able to tell me that that was meiosis. Okay, so if we take and we look at one bract then here from the cone and we expand it. So this is the bract, this is all sporophyte tissue. You've got your megasporangium, still diploid. Meiosis happens here, then eventually that will make the egg cell, okay? Now you have pollen grains, and notice that the pollen grains, they didn't have one blown up, so I added a picture to this figure here. If we take and look at one of these, they look like this over here. And so this is what it would look like underneath a microscope. This is very indicative of a pollen grain from a pine tree. So we like to say that they look like Mickey Mouse, right? They have these little wings or ears, and then they've got these dots inside of it. And I've labeled this one up here. So these wings are there in order to allow the pollen grains, once they are released then from the pollen cone, to catch the air currents. That's what the wings are for, is to catch the air currents. They are going to then catch the air currents. They're going to fly, if you will, or move, I should say not fly, but move from the pollen cone over here to the ovulate cone and land right on top of an ovule. And once they do that, then they've got to be able to get this little guy right here called the generative nucleus to fertilize the egg cell that's inside the ovule. But to get that, they actually have to grow a little tube. And so they have another nucleus, this one right here called the tube nucleus, and that is going to instruct then this pollen grain to grow a tube, and how to do it and when to do it, so that the generative nucleus can be delivered from this pollen grain and into the egg cell. Okay, so that would happen down around here. Okay, so let me just back up for just a second. So I said that the megasporangium is eventually going to make the egg cell here, which is what happens when meiosis occurs. So here's your surviving megaspore. The megaspore is then going to make the egg cells, and so the megaspore is now, they're going to use the term archegonia with 2 egg cells inside of it. Notice that the sporophyte tissue, once the pollen grain is in here at the bottom of the ovule, right, it's going to close up. And so this is the integument from a few screens back. It's going to close up so that the pollen grain stays inside this area here so that it can eventually fertilize an egg cell, a female gametophyte. And notice on this area right here, so these are the wings. I wish it was a little bit bigger, but there's a wing and there's a wing. They made their way then into the ovule, and now they need to take and deliver that generative nucleus, this guy right here, into one of the egg cells, one of the 2 egg cells. And to do that, they're going to start to grow this little tiny tube that you can see right there. And so if we go down here to the next step, the pollen tube has grown, and that generative nucleus then is going to fertilize I'm at the wrong one. That's the pollen tube nucleus. Here's the generative nucleus, or the sperm nucleus, that it has been released from the pollen tube into the egg cell. fertilization happens and we get N plus N. That's going to make a zygote. Zygote's going to go through mitosis and it's going to make an embryo. So this embryo, right, is this tiny little version of this pine tree that is embedded in this seed. Now the integuments are full seed coats, and the tan tissue is going to be the food reserve that the embryo will survive off of. When they are mature and ready to go, then if this is the one that I'm looking at here, I could say that it's this one here. So here are the seeds. The seeds have these wings on them. And when the seed is ready to be released, then the pine cone, the ovulate cone, is going to release them. They'll be carried by wind. This acts kind of like a little helicopter blade, and it will be hopefully carried to a new place away from the parent plant. It will land, it will germinate, and it will grow into a new seedling, which will then grow into a mature sporophyte. Okay, so I know that is a lot to look at, but you just need to kind of take a deep breath and go back and remind yourself that this is simply just alternation of generations, right? Except that the gametophyte stage now is highly reduced and is inside the sporophyte tissue, either the ovulate cone or the pollen cone. Okay, so this process from here to here is about 3 years, sometimes 5 years. So this is definitely not something that happens overnight, okay? It takes quite a bit of time for a pine cone to be able to produce mature seeds. Okay, so that's all that I have for you for this lecture. Another one will be coming to talk about the angiosperms, but remember that this is the seedless, not the seedless, the seed plants that lack a flower. Okay, any questions? Go ahead and send me an email. Thanks for listening.